Money can buy a Steinway grand, but it cannot buy the soul to play one. When a ruthless Wall Street titan sat down at a restaurant piano to humiliate a struggling waitress, he expected tears. What he got instead was a performance so devastating it ended his career. This is what happens when a bully picks a fight with the wrong person. The dining room of Maison Bellecour, Chicago's most absurdly exclusive lakefront restaurant, glowed amber under the light of 3 Venetian glass chandeliers that had been shipped, piece by piece, from a crumbling palazzo on the Grand Canal. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the wind off Lake Michigan rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows like an uninvited guest demanding entry. Inside, the warmth was manufactured and precise, the temperature calibrated to keep fur stoles on shoulders and red wine at exactly 63 degrees. Juliet Moreno stood behind the service station, polishing a silver bread knife, watching the dining room fill with its usual parade of power. She knew the choreography by heart now. The hedge fund wives, who arrived 15 minutes early to claim the corner banquettes. The tech founders who wore $700 sneakers with no socks as a declaration of casual dominance. The old money attorneys who ordered in murmurs, as though volume itself were vulgar. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and adjusted her black vest. 28 years old, 5'6" in the flat-soled shoes the restaurant required, with hands that could span a tenth on a keyboard and a memory that could hold an entire Rachmaninoff concerto without dropping a single note. Those hands now carried oyster platters and folded linen napkins into swans. 4 years ago, Juliet had been a third-year doctoral candidate at the Eastman School of Music in Rochester, studying advanced composition and performance under the legendary Professor Ackerman. Her senior recital of Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 2 had drawn a standing ovation and a handwritten note from the dean calling it the finest student performance in the school's history. 2 recording labels had expressed preliminary interest. The Chicago Symphony's Youth Fellowship had offered her a residency. Everything she had worked for since she first touched a piano at age 4 in her grandmother's living room in San Antonio was falling into place with the quiet inevitability of a chord resolving to its tonic. Then her brother, Marco, 17 and fearless and stupid in the way only teenage boys can be, flipped his best friend's car on a rain-slicked stretch of I-90 outside of Buffalo. The spinal cord injury was incomplete, which the doctors said was the good news. The bad news filled a folder 3 inches thick. Surgeries, rehabilitation, a specialized facility in Denver that accepted only 40 patients a year and cost more per month than her father's machine shop in San Antonio grossed in 6. Her parents had no insurance that covered this. Her mother's English was still fragile after 22 years in Texas, and her father, Tomas, a proud and quiet man who had crossed the border at 19 with $80 and a tool belt, simply could not navigate the suffocating labyrinth of American healthcare bureaucracy. So Juliet navigated it for them. She deferred her studies. She moved to Chicago because the money was better. She picked up double shifts at Maison Bellecour because the tips from rich people who didn't look at you were still better than the tips from regular people who did. Every 2 weeks, she wired 3/4 of her income to the rehabilitation center in Denver. Marco was making progress. He could feel his toes now. He had wiggled his left foot last Tuesday, and Juliet had cried in the walk-in freezer for 10 minutes before clocking back in to serve a 12-topper birthday party for a woman who complained that the candles on her cake were the wrong shade of gold. Tonight, the maitre d', a fastidious man named Alain, who had been poached from a Michelin-starred restaurant in Montreal, appeared at her elbow with the expression of someone who had just swallowed a lemon and was trying to smile about it. "Table 4, he said, barely moving his lips. Garrett Blackwood. He just walked in with a party of 3. I'm putting you on him. Juliet's stomach tightened. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Garrett Blackwood was the 40-year-old founder and CEO of Obsidian Capital, a private equity firm that had spent the last decade buying Midwestern manufacturing companies, stripping them to the studs, and selling the scraps for enormous profit. Entire towns in Ohio and Michigan had been hollowed out by his acquisitions. He was on the cover of Forbes at 32. By 35, he had purchased a penthouse in the Waldorf Astoria, a villa in Lake Como, and a reputation for cruelty that preceded him into every room like an advanced security team. He also fancied himself a classical pianist. This was the detail that made Juliet's jaw tighten. Blackwood had donated $250,000 to the Lyric Opera last year, not out of generosity, but to secure a seat on their board and access to their annual gala stage, where he performed a self-selected Chopin nocturne every December to polite, purchased applause. The Chicago Tribune's music critic had once described his playing as technically adequate and emotionally vacant, like a spreadsheet set to music. Blackwood had reportedly threatened to pull his funding unless the review was retracted. It was not retracted. He pulled his funding. Then he donated double the amount the following year just to remind everyone that money always had the final word. Juliet approached table 4 with a practiced, neutral expression. Blackwood sat at the center of the curved leather booth, his charcoal suit so perfectly tailored, it looked like it had been painted on. To his left sat a woman Juliet recognized from the society pages, Diana Hargrove, a corporate restructuring attorney known for her ability to dismantle companies with the cheerful efficiency of someone organizing a closet. To Blackwood's right was a man Juliet did not recognize, older, maybe 65, with sharp cheekbones, silver-framed glasses, and the unhurried stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove. A small enamel pin on his lapel bore the insignia of the Berlin Philharmonic. "Good evening," Juliet said, her voice warm and measured. "Welcome to Maison Belcourt. May I start you with something from the bar?" Blackwood did not look up. He was typing on his phone with his thumbs, his brow furrowed in concentration, as though the fate of nations depended on his text message. "Old-fashioned," he said to the air. "Woodford Reserve, not the well bourbon. 1 large ice cube, not 2 small ones. If I see 2 small ones, I'm sending it back." "Of course." Juliet turned to Diana Hargrove, who at least had the decency to make eye contact. "The Sancerre, please." "Thank you." Diana's smile was brief and mechanical, the smile of a woman who tipped exactly 20% regardless of service quality, because it was efficient. The older gentleman looked at Juliet with a warmth that caught her off guard. "A glass of whatever red you love most," he said, his English lightly accented. "German, maybe Austrian." "I trust your taste." Juliet allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "The Barolo. It's drinking beautifully right now. Then the Barolo it is." When Juliet returned with the drinks, Blackwood had apparently finished his phone business and was now holding court. She set his old-fashioned down, 1 large ice cube, and began to step back. "Hold on," Blackwood said, finally looking at her. His eyes were the color of wet slate, and they performed a quick, dismissive inventory of her person, pausing at her name tag. "Juliet, like the play. Tell me, Juliet, do you know what tonight is?" "Friday evening, Mr. Blackwood. It's the eve of the Obsidian Capital Annual Investor Summit, which means every person in this restaurant tonight who manages real money is watching me, so I need this dinner to be flawless, not good. Flawless. Can you manage that, or should I request someone with more experience?" "I've been here 3 years, sir. You're in good hands." Blackwood smirked. 3 years. A career waitress, charming. He turned back to his guests, effectively deleting her from his awareness. Over the next 90 minutes, Blackwood treated Juliet the way a careless child treats a toy he's already bored with. He sent back his risotto because the truffle shavings were sliced, not shaved. He complained that his water was too cold. He snapped his fingers, actually snapped his fingers, to summon her when his bread plate needed clearing, then launched into a loud monologue about work ethic while she stood 3 feet away, holding his dirty dishes. "The problem with this country," Blackwood declared, swirling his second old-fashioned, "is that we've convinced an entire generation that showing up is the same as achieving. It's not. Showing up is what she does." He tipped his glass toward Juliet without looking at her. "Achievement is what I do. There's a biological difference. Some people are wired to build, others are wired to carry plates. It's not cruel. It's just science." Diana Hargrove shifted uncomfortably, crossing her legs. "Garrett, that's a bit much." "It's honest, Diana. I don't pretend the world is flat just because the truth makes people uncomfortable." The older gentleman said nothing. He simply watched, his silver-framed glasses catching the chandelier light, his expression unreadable. Juliet cleared the bread plates. Her knuckles were white against the porcelain. She could feel the familiar heat building behind her sternum, the same heat she had learned to swallow every single shift. Marco's face. Marco wiggling his toes. The wire transfer confirmation. Breathe. The breaking point arrived with dessert. Maison Belcourt had a Steinway Model B grand piano positioned near the tall windows overlooking the lake. It was mostly decorative. On weekends, a hired pianist played soft jazz during the dinner service. Tonight, the bench was empty. The piano sat in a pool of amber light, its lid propped open, its keys gleaming like teeth. Blackwood noticed it as the chocolate soufflé arrived. His eyes lit up with a particular kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. Juliet recognized that look. She had seen it in recital halls, in practice rooms, in the mirror. It was the look of someone who wanted an audience. "Is that piano available?" Blackwood asked, already standing. Alain, the maitre d', materialized instantly. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. It would be our pleasure." Blackwood adjusted his cufflinks, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the Steinway with the self-conscious gravity of a man who believed he was about to deliver a gift to the room. He sat down, flexed his fingers, and launched into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The room quieted. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations dissolved into whispers. He was not terrible. Juliet had to give him that. His technique was clean, his fingering precise, steady. But he played the way he spoke, loudly, aggressively, with an emphasis on control rather than feeling. The ballade's famous lyrical passages, the sections that were supposed to ache, that were supposed to make you feel the specific gravity of human longing, came out flat and polished, like a photograph of a sunset rather than the sunset itself. He hit every note. He missed every meaning. When he finished, the dining room offered a generous round of applause. Blackwood stood, buttoned his jacket again, and swept a small theatrical bow. As he walked back toward table 4, his path took him directly past the service station, where Juliet was arranging espresso cups on a tray. He stopped. Something about her expression, maybe the almost imperceptible tension in her jaw, maybe the way her eyes had tracked his hands on the keyboard with an intensity that went beyond polite attention, triggered his radar. "Did you enjoy that, Juliet?" he asked, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. The performance was still going. This was the encore. "It was lovely, Mr. Blackwood. Lovely." He repeated the word as though she'd insulted him. You know, most people who say lovely about Chopin have no idea what they're actually hearing. It's like a dog listening to a symphony. It hears the noise, but it can't comprehend the music. He smiled at his own cleverness. "Tell me, honestly, Do you even know what piece I just played?" The dining room was watching now. Conversations at 3 nearby tables had stopped entirely. Diana Hargrove was staring at her wineglass as though she wanted to crawl inside it. "I know what you played," Juliet said quietly. "Oh?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. He leaned against the service station, crossing his arms. "Enlighten me." Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Opus 23, composed in 1835, dedicated to Baron Stockhausen. Widely considered one of the most technically demanding pieces in the Romantic piano repertoire. The smirk on Blackwood's face flickered, but only for a moment. He recovered quickly, the way confident men always do when reality briefly disagrees with their self-image. Well, someone's been reading the program notes. That's adorable." He turned to the older gentleman at his table, raising his voice so the room could enjoy his wit. "See, Klaus, this is exactly what I mean. A little bit of Googled knowledge and suddenly everyone's an expert. She probably read a Wikipedia article on her break and thinks she understands romantic composition. This is the democratization of mediocrity in real time." The older gentleman, Klaus, set down his wineglass very carefully. His expression had shifted from neutral to something colder, something Juliet recognized from her years at Eastman, the look a master gives when a student has gone too far. "Actually," Blackwood continued, fully committed now to the performance of his own superiority, "I'll make it simple." He pulled a cocktail napkin from the service station and produced a heavy silver pen from his breast pocket. He scrawled something on the napkin and slid it toward Juliet with a flourish. "Read that." Juliet looked down. On the napkin, in sharp, angular handwriting, Blackwood had written a line of musical notation, specifically the opening bars of the Chopin ballade he had just played, transcribed from memory onto the thin paper. Below it, he had written, "Can your waitress brain even read this, or does it just look like hieroglyphics?" He grinned at the room. Several people looked away. One woman at a nearby table actually covered her mouth with her hand. Juliet stared at the napkin. The espresso cups on her tray trembled slightly. Not from fear, from something much older and much more dangerous. She picked up the napkin. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. "You made 2 errors, Juliet said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried with the clarity of a bell struck in a silent cathedral. "The 3rd measure. You've written an E natural in the left hand. It should be an E flat, and in the 5th measure, you've written the grace note as a 32nd. Chopin's autograph manuscript, which I have studied in person at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, clearly indicates a 64th note with an appoggiatura marking." The blood left Garrett Blackwood's face the way color leaves the sky after sunset. Slowly, then all at once, Juliet placed the napkin back on the counter. Then she did something she had not done in 4 years. She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and set it on the service station beside the espresso tray. She walked past Blackwood without looking at him, crossed the dining room floor, and sat down at the Steinway. The room went absolutely silent. Alain, frozen near the hostess stand, opened his mouth to intervene and then closed it. Something in the way, Juliet placed her hands on the keys, the specific angle of her wrists, the spine straightened into a posture that had been drilled into her since childhood, told him that interrupting would be a mistake he would regret for the rest of his career. Juliet closed her eyes. For one suspended moment, she was not in a restaurant. She was in the recital hall at Eastman. She was in her grandmother's living room in San Antonio, age 4, reaching for the keys of the old upright that smelled like lemon polish and cigarette smoke. She was every version of herself that music had ever made her, all at once, all alive, all furious. She played Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. But she did not play it the way Blackwood had played it. She played it the way Chopin had intended it, as a story, as a confession, as a war between beauty and grief, fought on 88 black and white keys. The opening measures unfolded slowly, gently, like a hand reaching out in darkness. Then the melody climbed, gathered force, and the first turbulent passage broke across the room like a wave smashing against a seawall. Her left hand drove the bass notes with a ferocity that made the crystal wine glasses on the nearest table vibrate. Her right hand sang the melody with such aching, precise tenderness that a woman at table 9 pressed her napkin to her eyes without understanding why. She played the way she had played at Eastman. She played the way she played in her dreams, on the battered electronic keyboard in her studio apartment at 2 in the morning with the headphones on so the neighbors wouldn't complain. She played 4 years of swallowed rage and silent grief and stacked dishes and snapped fingers and 3/4 paychecks wired to Denver and her brother's face on a video call saying, "Jules, I wiggled my foot today," while she sat in a walk-in freezer and cried. She played all of it. Every note was a door she had closed. Every phrase was a room she had locked. And now, in this ridiculous, overpriced, chandelier-dripping temple of money and pretension, she kicked every single one of those doors open. The ballad's final passage is a hurricane. It demands speed, power, and a kind of controlled recklessness that separates concert pianists from everyone else. Juliet played it at full tempo. Her hands were a blur. The Steinway roared. The final chords landed like thunder, and then silence. For 3 full seconds, no one in the dining room moved. Then the older gentleman at table 4, Klaus, stood up. He did not clap politely. He brought his hands together once, twice, 3 times, slowly and deliberately, the way one acknowledges not entertainment, but something sacred. Then he clapped harder, faster, and the room erupted. Tables that had nothing to do with the drama stood and applauded. A bartender set down the shaker he was holding and joined in. Even Alain, who prided himself on emotional neutrality the way other people prided themselves on marathon times, was clapping. Garrett Blackwood stood exactly where Juliet had left him, beside the service station, his mouth slightly open, his silver pen still in his hand. He looked like a man who had just watched his own house burn down and could not locate the emotion appropriate to the occasion. Klaus walked directly to the piano. Up close, Juliet could see that his silver-framed glasses were actually titanium, and the Berlin Philharmonic pin was accompanied by a second, smaller pin, the emblem of the Vienna State Opera. "My name is Klaus Hartmann," he said, and Juliet felt the floor shift beneath her. She knew that name. Every serious musician on the planet knew that name. Klaus Hartmann was the principal conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic and the artistic director of the Salzburg Festival. He was, by virtually every measure that mattered, one of the 5 most powerful people in classical music. "I know who you are," Juliet said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her hands were trembling now, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a delayed wave. "Then you know that I do not say this lightly." Hartmann reached into his jacket and produced a card. Not a business card, a handwritten note on heavy cream-colored stock, the kind of paper that cost more per sheet than Juliet made in an hour. "I am staging a new production of Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 2 for next season's opening at the Musikverein. I have been searching for a soloist for 11 months. I believe I have just found her." Julia took the card. Her fingers left faint smudges on the expensive paper. "Miss Moreno, Juliet Moreno, Miss Moreno. Your Chopin was the most moving performance I have witnessed in 20 years. And I once watched Argerich play the same piece in a rainstorm in Buenos Aires, with the power cutting in and out." He glanced over his shoulder at Blackwood, who was now sitting back at table 4 alone, Diana Hargrove having quietly excused herself and vanished. I came to Chicago to evaluate Mr. Blackwood's suitability as a patron for our new education initiative. I believe that evaluation is now complete." He said this loudly enough for Blackwood to hear. It was a deliberate choice. Klaus Hartmann had not survived 40 years in the brutally political world of European orchestral music by being accidentally audible. Blackwood's face went from pale to a deep, mottled crimson. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the hardwood. "Klaus, be reasonable. She's a waitress. She played one piece. You cannot seriously be comparing this to—" "I am not comparing, Mr. Blackwood." Hartmann's voice was ice-sculpted into syllables. "Comparison requires two subjects of similar quality. What you played earlier this evening was a competent technical exercise. What Miss Moreno just played was music. There is a difference, and if you cannot hear it, that tells me everything I need to know about your ear, your judgment, and your fitness to represent our institution." Blackwood's mouth worked silently. No sound came out. Hartmann turned back to Juliet. "I will have my office contact you on Monday. Please be ready to discuss terms. I suspect your circumstances are about to change rather dramatically." He left $200 bills on the table, nodded once to Alain, and walked out of Maison Belcourt into the cold Chicago night with the unhurried stride of a man who had accomplished exactly what he came to do, just not in the way he had expected to accomplish it. Juliet stood beside the Steinway for a long moment after Hartmann left. The dining room slowly resumed its normal rhythms, conversations restarting, forks lifting, wine pouring, but the air had changed. Something irreversible had happened in this room, and everyone present knew they had witnessed it. She walked back to the service station. Her apron was still folded where she had left it. She looked at it, then looked at Alain. "I'm done," she said. Alain, to his credit, simply nodded. "I know." Juliet walked through the kitchen, past the line cooks who stared at her with open mouths, because sound travels through restaurant walls, and they had heard every note, and out the back door into the alley. The October wind hit her like a slap. She leaned against the brick wall, clutching Klaus Hartmann's cream-colored card, and called her brother. "Marco? It's me. I played tonight. I actually played." On the other end, in a rehabilitation room in Denver, a 17-year-old boy who was learning to wiggle his toes started to cry. 7 months later, the gilded concert hall of the Musikverein in Vienna hummed with the particular electricity that precedes a historic performance. Every seat in the house was filled. The chandeliers blazed. The Vienna Philharmonic sat poised on stage, instruments at the ready, Klaus Hartmann on the podium, with his baton raised. Juliet Moreno walked to the Steinway Concert Grand at center stage, wearing a midnight blue gown that her mother had helped her pick out over a video call from San Antonio, both of them crying and laughing at the same time, because the price tag was more than Thomas made in a month, and Juliet could now afford it without blinking. Marco sat in the front row, in a wheelchair, but sitting upright, which itself was a kind of miracle. Beside him sat Thomas and her mother, Lucia, who had flown on an airplane for the first time in her life and kept crossing herself during takeoff. True to every promise, Hartmann's offices had moved with breathtaking efficiency. Within weeks of that night in Chicago, Juliet had been formally appointed as the featured soloist for the Vienna Philharmonic's new season. The Hartmann Foundation, Klaus's personal charitable trust, had arranged for Marco's transfer to a world-class neurological rehabilitation center in Zurich, fully funded. The crushing monthly wire transfers stopped. For the first time in 4 years, Juliet's paycheck belonged to Juliet. She did not merely play the Prokofiev that night, she detonated it. The second concerto is a monster, a 40-minute marathon of technical savagery and emotional devastation written by a 21-year-old Russian who had just lost his best friend to suicide. It demands everything a pianist has and then asks for more. Juliet gave it more. The Viennese audience, famously reserved, famously difficult, gave her an 11-minute standing ovation. 3 curtain calls. Klaus Hartmann, not a man prone to public displays of sentiment, embraced her on stage. The reviews were incandescent. The Süddeutsche Zeitung called her the most electrifying debut in a generation. The New York Times ran a feature with the headline, "From a Chicago restaurant to the Musikverein, the Juliet Moreno story." Recording contracts materialized. A documentary crew from PBS reached out. The London Symphony, the Berlin Philharmonic, and the New York Philharmonic all extended invitations for the following season. Back in Chicago, the world Garrett Blackwood had built was collapsing, with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier calving into the sea. The night at Maison Belcourt had gone viral before dessert was cleared. 13 diners had recorded Juliet's performance on their phones. 7 of those videos hit social media within the hour. By morning, the most watched clip had 4 million views and a caption that read, "Billionaire humiliates waitress. Waitress sits down at piano and humiliates billionaire." Blackwood's name trended on every platform for 3 consecutive days, and not in the way a man who runs a private equity firm wants his name to trend. Klaus Hartmann's withdrawal of patronage consideration was only the first domino. The Lyric Opera of Chicago quietly removed Blackwood from its board, citing a strategic realignment of our donor relationships. 2 of Obsidian Capital's largest institutional investors, a pension fund from Michigan and a sovereign wealth fund from Norway, issued statements expressing concern about leadership character and reputational risk. The Norwegian fund pulled its capital entirely, taking $400 million with it. Within 5 months, Obsidian Capital's assets under management had shrunk by nearly a third. Blackwood, desperate and thrashing, attempted a pivot. He announced plans to launch a new fund focused on arts and culture investment, a transparent attempt to rehabilitate his shattered public image. The centerpiece of this strategy was the acquisition of a prestigious but financially struggling European music technology company called Resonance Labs, which had developed revolutionary AI-assisted software for restoring damaged historical recordings. If Blackwood could acquire Resonance Labs, he could position himself as a patron of the arts, a technologist, and a visionary all at once, burying the Chicago piano incident under an avalanche of good press. The acquisition meeting was scheduled for Vienna. Blackwood flew commercial, first class, because the private jet had been sold 3 months earlier to cover operating shortfalls. He arrived at the Hotel Imperial with his 2 remaining lawyers and a PowerPoint presentation that his marketing team had spent 6 weeks polishing to a mirror shine. The conference room was old Habsburg grandeur. 16-foot ceilings, heavy burgundy drapes, oil paintings of composers on the walls. Mozart stared down from above the fireplace with an expression that seemed, to Blackwood's increasingly paranoid eyes, faintly amused. The representatives of the holding company that owned Resonance Labs were 15 minutes late. Blackwood checked his watch. His lawyers shuffled papers. The coffee grew cold. Then the doors opened, and Klaus Hartmann walked in. Blackwood's stomach dropped through the floor. "Klaus." The word came out strangled. "What are you doing here?" "I sit on the board of the holding company that owns Resonance Labs," Hartmann said pleasantly, settling into a chair across the long table. In fact, Resonance Labs was built using archival recordings preserved and catalogued by our Foundation's Restoration Initiative, an initiative led, I should mention, by our Director of Musical Heritage. He paused, letting the silence do its work. "I believe you two have met." Footsteps echoed on marble. Juliet Moreno walked into the conference room. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a white silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under her arm. She moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who had spent 7 months being told by the most demanding audiences on earth that she was extraordinary and had finally, quietly, started to believe it. Blackwood physically flinched. His lawyers exchanged a glance that communicated, in the universal silent language of attorneys, that their billable hours were about to become extremely uncomfortable. "Miss Moreno." Blackwood's voice was barely audible. "Mr. Blackwood." Juliet sat down across from him and opened her portfolio. No emotion, no drama, just facts. "We have reviewed Obsidian Capital's acquisition proposal. We have also reviewed your firm's current financial position, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is significantly weaker than what your proposal represents." She slid a bound document across the table. "Your assets under management have declined by 31% in 7 months. Your 2 largest remaining investors have initiated preliminary withdrawal proceedings. Your operating expenses exceed your management fee revenue by a ratio that would concern a first-year accounting student." Blackwood's lawyers flipped through the document with the desperate speed of men looking for a fire exit. "How did you obtain these figures?" Blackwood demanded, but there was no force behind it. He sounded like a man asking a question he already knew the answer to. "Diana Hargrove provided them," Juliet said. "She joined the Hartman Foundation's advisory board 4 months ago. She believes, as we do, that Obsidian Capital under its current leadership represents an unacceptable reputational and fiduciary risk to any institutional partner." Blackwood closed his eyes. "Diana." Of course, the restructuring attorney who had sat at his table that night, who had watched him humiliate a waitress and said nothing but remembered everything, had quietly and methodically handed his opponents the knife they needed to finish him. Juliet continued, her tone carrying the precision of a metronome. "We are formally declining your acquisition offer. However, the Hartman Foundation's investment arm is prepared to make a counteroffer. We will purchase Obsidian Capital's outstanding debt obligations at a significant discount. We will initiate a structured dissolution of the fund. Your remaining investors will be made whole. You will not. You can't." Blackwood's voice cracked. "I built that firm. 15 years. It's everything I have. You built it on the labor of people you considered beneath you," Juliet replied. "Factory workers in Toledo, steel workers in Gary, a waitress in Chicago, people who showed up every day, carried the weight, and never once confused endurance with weakness." She leaned forward slightly. "You told me that some people are wired to build, and some are wired to carry plates. You were wrong about which one you are." Garrett Blackwood lowered his head into his hands. The conference room was silent, except for the distant sound of a string quartet rehearsing somewhere in the hotel, playing, of all things, Chopin. Juliet closed her portfolio. She stood. She looked at the broken man across the table, and she felt not triumph exactly, but something quieter and more durable. Justice. Not the loud theatrical kind, the kind that arrives on time, does its work, and leaves without making a speech. She turned toward the door. Klaus Hartmann watched her with the same expression he had worn in the restaurant that night. The look of a man who had discovered something rare and knew exactly what it was worth. At the threshold, Juliet paused. She looked back over her shoulder, and for just a moment the faintest trace of a smile crossed her face. "La musica è l'unica lingua che I tiranni non possono corrompere," she said softly. "Music is the only language that tyrants cannot corrupt." She walked out into the brilliant Vienna afternoon, where the October sun caught the spires of St. Stephen's Cathedral and turned them to gold, and she did not look back.